I didn't know my marriage had already ended until I heard his voice say another woman's name. The voicemail came in at 2:17 a.m., the hour when the house breathes on its own and every sound feels louder than it should. I was awake, staring at the ceiling fan as it clicked its tired rhythm, counting the small noises that prove a life is still happening around you. My phone buzzed once on the nightstand. I didn't reach for it right away. There's a kind of instinct that tells you when a moment will divide your life into before and after. When I finally pressed play, I expected his familiar gentleness. "Hey babe, I'm running late," or "Did you remember to lock the back door?" Instead, I heard him exhale, slow and careful, like he was choosing each word with a reverence he hadn't used with me in years. "Please don't panic," he said. "I just need you to listen. I'm on my way, and I'll explain everything when I get there." Then he said her name, not mine. The silence after that name felt physical, heavy, as if the air in the room had thickened. I sat up in bed, the sheets tangled around my legs, my heart thudding with a dull insistence that felt almost polite. Tap, 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 as though it were asking permission to break. I replayed the message again and again. Each time his voice sounded steadier, calmer. Each time that other name landed in my chest with the same quiet violence. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't even move for a while. I just sat there, holding my phone like it might confess something else if I squeezed hard enough. It wasn't meant for me. I knew that with a certainty that didn't require proof. The voicemail had slipped into my life by accident, like a letter dropped through the wrong mail slot, and now I was holding a truth that had been living without me. I have learned that betrayal rarely announces itself with chaos. Most times it arrives softly, wearing the familiar clothes of the person you trust most. Before that night, my life was quiet in a way that felt earned. Not exciting, not glamorous, just steady. My husband, Daniel, and I had been married for 19 years. We lived in a narrow blue house with a porch that sagged a little in the middle, the kind of place where you learn the sounds it makes as it settles at night. We had no children, not by choice at first, then by acceptance. We filled the space with habits instead. Sunday morning pancakes, Thursday grocery runs, Friday movies where one of us always fell asleep halfway through. Daniel used to hum when he brushed his teeth. I used to complain about it, smiling as I did. He always made coffee too strong, and I always watered mine down. These were the small negotiations of a long marriage, the gentle compromises that feel like love because they are practiced daily. I worked at the local library, a place that smelled of old paper and lemon cleaner. Daniel worked in logistics for a regional company. Long hours, occasional travel, a phone that never seemed to leave his hand. When people asked us how we'd stayed together so long, I used to say, "We're good at the quiet parts." And I believed that. I still do in a way. But quiet can also hide things. The first time I felt something shift, it was so minor I laughed it off. Daniel came home one evening and went straight to the shower without kissing me hello. The water ran longer than usual. When he came out, his face was softer somehow, like he'd been holding a smile underwater and finally let it go. He told me he was tired. I told him dinner was in the oven. We ate without talking much, the clink of forks filling the spaces where words used to live. Over the next few weeks, those spaces widened. He started taking calls on the porch, his back turned toward the living room. He kept his phone face down on the table, something he'd never bothered to do before. When I asked how work was going, he said fine, with a finality that closed the door on further questions. I told myself it was stress. Men his age worry quietly, I'd heard. They carry the weight in their shoulders, in the crease between their eyebrows. I noticed that crease more often now. I rubbed it with my thumb when he slept, tracing the familiar lines of a face I had memorized in the dark. We still shared a bed, we still said goodnight, we still moved around each other with the choreography of a couple who knows where the other will be without looking. That's the thing about long marriages. They don't end all at once. They thin out, slowly, until you don't notice the light passing through. The day before the voicemail, Daniel forgot our anniversary. 19 isn't a round number, it doesn't demand balloons or cards shaped like hearts, but we had always marked it quietly. Takeout from the Italian place on Main, a bottle of red wine we both pretended we understood. That night I set the table anyway. I lit the small candle we only used for special occasions. When Daniel walked in and glanced at the setup, confusion crossed his face before it smoothed itself away. "Oh," he said, "right. I'm sorry." He kissed my cheek, quick and distracted, and asked if we could celebrate over the weekend instead. His eyes flicked to his phone as he said it. I nodded. I always nodded. Later, as I washed the dishes, I caught my reflection in the dark window. The candlelight made my face look older, more tired than I felt. I pressed my palm against the glass and tried to remember when I'd started feeling like a guest in my own marriage. The voicemail arrived the next night. I didn't tell anyone about it, not right away. I didn't confront Daniel when he came home hours later, smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine. I went through the motions. I asked if he was hungry. I told him I was tired. I lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing, the space between us a quiet accusation. In the morning, he left early, kissing my forehead with a tenderness that felt borrowed. I waited until the house was empty. Then I sat at the kitchen table, the voicemail playing softly through my phone's speaker, his voice filling the room we'd built together. "Please don't panic," he had said. I didn't panic. I planned. Because when the truth enters your life by accident, it asks something of you. It asks whether you will look away or whether you will finally listen. And I was done pretending not to hear. By the third time I listened to the voicemail that morning, I noticed things I hadn't heard before. The pause before he spoke her name. The way his voice softened, as if he were trying not to frighten someone who trusted him. There was an intimacy in that caution, a tenderness that didn't belong to me anymore. I turned the phone face down on the table and stared at the faint ring left by last night's coffee mug. It had soaked into the wood, a pale circle that wouldn't come out no matter how much I scrubbed. I'd learned long ago that some marks are meant to stay, to remind you of what passed through. I made myself breakfast, toast, burnt on one side the way Daniel used to tease me about. The smell filled the kitchen, sharp and familiar, and for a moment I nearly convinced myself that nothing had changed. But when I sat down alone, the chair across from me empty, the truth settled back into place. I spent that day doing ordinary things with unusual care. I folded laundry, smoothing each crease as if precision could keep my hands from shaking. I watered the plants on the windowsill, watching the soil darken as it drank. I went to work and returned books to their shelves, my fingers brushing spines I'd touched 100 times before. Every task felt like a rehearsal for something I didn't yet understand. Daniel texted once around noon. "Long day, don't wait up." I stared at the message until the words blurred. He used to call on his lunch break just to tell me what he was eating, as if narrating his day would keep us tethered together. Now even his excuses were efficient. That evening, I did something I'd never done in 19 years of marriage. I went into his study. It wasn't locked. Daniel had never given me a reason to feel unwelcome in any room of our house. The desk was neat, his pen placed parallel to the edge, a stack of folders aligned just so. I stood there for a moment, my hands at my sides, feeling like an intruder in a place I'd helped pay for. I wasn't looking for proof, not exactly. I think I was looking for permission to stop being gentle with the questions I'd been asking myself for months. I opened the desk drawer slowly, as if the wood might protest. Inside were the usual things: receipts, a spare set of keys, a small notebook he kept for work calls. I flipped through it, my breath shallow. Most of the pages were filled with numbers and abbreviations that meant nothing to me. Then, halfway through, I saw her name. It was written once, then again, the letters careful and deliberate. Next to it was a time, a place. Not romantic, not dramatic, just logistics. The quiet machinery of a life happening elsewhere. I closed the notebook and slid it back into the drawer, my hands trembling now despite my efforts. I leaned against the desk, pressing my forehead to the cool surface, and let the room steady me. This was not a moment for collapse. Not yet. When Daniel came home that night, he was late again. He moved through the house softly, as if trying not to wake something sleeping. I watched him from the couch, my face neutral, my heart loud. "Everything okay?" he asked, setting his bag down. "Fine," I said. The word tasted different now. We ate dinner in silence. At one point, his phone buzzed, and he glanced at it quickly before turning it face down. I noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his knee bounced under the table. "Who's that?" I asked lightly. He looked up, startled. "Just work." I nodded. The candle between us flickered, and for a moment I wondered how many lies can fit in a room before the walls start to listen. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling we'd meant to fix years ago. I thought about all the times I'd defended him to friends who said he seemed distant, about the way I'd swallowed my own loneliness, telling myself it was just a phase. Love, I'd believed, was about patience. By morning, I understood something I hadn't before. Patience without honesty is just another way to disappear. I waited 2 more days before I did anything. I needed clarity, not assumptions. On the 3rd day, Daniel left his phone on the kitchen counter when he went to shower. I didn't touch it at first. I made tea. I stood by the window and watched a delivery truck struggle to park across the street. Then I picked it up. I didn't go through everything. I didn't need to. There was a thread of messages with a name I now recognized, the conversation clipped and careful at first, then gradually warmer. There were apologies for missed calls, reassurances, plans postponed and rearranged. There was concern when he didn't respond quickly enough. There was love, written in a language he had stopped using with me. I set the phone down exactly where I'd found it. When Daniel came back into the kitchen, his hair damp, his expression relaxed, something inside me hardened into resolve. "I heard your voicemail," I said. The words hung between us, fragile and sharp. He froze, not in anger, not in denial, just still, the way people do when they realize the ground beneath them has shifted. "What voicemail?" he asked, though his eyes had already given him away. "The one you left for her, the one that came to me by mistake." He sat down heavily in the chair across from me. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture I'd seen countless times after long days. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," he said quietly. I almost laughed at that. Almost. "Was it supposed to happen at all?" I asked. He looked up at me then, really looked, and I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time: fear. Not of losing me exactly, but of being seen fully without the protection of half-truths. "I didn't plan it. It just happened." That sentence, it's one I've heard echoed in 100 other stories, whispered as if inevitability absolves responsibility. I folded my hands in my lap, feeling the steadiness there. She has a name and a place in your life. That doesn't happen by accident. He exhaled slowly, the fight leaving him. I didn't mean to hurt you. I know, and I did. That was the cruelest part. We sat there in the quiet kitchen, the morning light unforgiving in its honesty, and I understood that the voicemail wasn't the betrayal. It was the invitation to finally stop lying to myself. After the words were finally out in the open, the house felt different, as if it were holding its breath, waiting to see what we would do next. Daniel sat across from me, his hands wrapped around a mug he hadn't touched, staring into it as though answers might rise from the steam. I didn't ask who she was right away. I already knew enough to know that names don't soften truths, they sharpen them. "How long?" I asked instead. He hesitated. That pause told me more than the number ever could. "Almost a year," he said finally. A year. 4 seasons of my life, birthdays, holidays, quiet mornings I'd mistaken for peace. I nodded slowly, letting the weight of that time settle without letting it crush me. "And you were going to keep going?" I asked. "I didn't know how to stop," he said, his voice low. "Every time I thought about telling you, I saw your face. I couldn't be the one to do that to you." I studied him then, the man I had loved for nearly 2 decades, who now spoke as if honesty were a cruelty rather than a kindness. "You already did," I said. "You just let time do it for you." He swallowed hard. "She makes me feel seen." The words landed gently, but they cut all the same. I had spent years seeing him, packing his lunches, listening to his stories, adjusting my life around the rhythm of his needs. I wondered when that vision had become invisible. "Does she know about me?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "At first I told her I was separated, then I told her the truth." "And she stayed," I said. He nodded. That hurt in a different way, not sharper, just deeper. We talked for hours after that, the conversation circling the same truths from different angles. He told me about meeting her at a conference, about conversations that started as complaints about work and drifted into something more personal. He spoke carefully, as if trying to spare me details, but I didn't stop him. I needed to understand the shape of what had replaced me. "She's not asking me to leave you," he said at one point, as if that were a kindness. I looked at him steadily. "And what are you asking yourself?" He didn't answer. That night we slept in separate rooms. I lay in the guest bed, listening to the house settle, the ticking clock louder without his breathing beside me. I thought about all the small ways I'd shrunk myself to fit the version of marriage I believed in, how I'd learned to be agreeable, to be patient, to be the calm one. In the morning, I woke with a clarity that surprised me. Pain, I was learning, has a way of sharpening the mind once the initial shock passes. "I want you to leave," I told him over breakfast. He looked up quickly. "For how long?" "I don't know," I said, "long enough for me to hear my own thoughts without yours filling the room." He nodded, relief and sadness mingling on his face. "I'll stay at a hotel," he said. "No," I replied, "stay with her." The words felt steady when I said them, like a line drawn cleanly. "You've already been there," I added. "Don't pretend otherwise now." He didn't argue. After he left, the silence was overwhelming. I moved through the house, touching familiar things, the back of the couch, the edge of the counter, as if reassuring myself they were still real. I boxed up his belongings methodically, labeling each container in neat handwriting. The act of naming things gave me a sense of order when my life felt anything but. Friends noticed something was wrong before I said a word. They always do. When I finally told my sister, her voice cracked with anger on my behalf. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to pay attention to myself." The next few weeks were a strange blend of grief and clarity. Daniel called occasionally, careful and tentative. I answered when I felt strong enough. We spoke about logistics, bills, schedules, the quiet dismantling of a shared life. He asked if there was anything he could do. "There is," I said once. "Be honest, at least now." He tried. One afternoon, while sorting through paperwork, I found an envelope tucked behind the filing cabinet. Inside were financial documents, bank statements I hadn't seen, a separate account opened months earlier. My stomach tightened as I flipped through them. Large withdrawals, transfers I didn't recognize. When I confronted Daniel about it over the phone, his voice faltered. "I was planning ahead," he said. "For what?" I asked. "For a future," he admitted. "Not ours." That was the moment something in me shifted from sadness to resolve. Betrayal of the heart is devastating, but betrayal of trust, of the shared life you built piece by piece, is something else entirely. I met with a lawyer the next day. She was calm, professional, her office smelling faintly of peppermint tea. She explained my options clearly, without judgment. "You have more power than you think," she said. I held on to that sentence as I left her office, the winter air sharp against my cheeks. Power, I was learning, doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like preparation. The next time Daniel came by the house, I was ready. "We need to talk about the money," I said. He sighed, the weight of consequences finally visible in his posture. "I was going to tell you." "When?" I asked. "After you'd moved on completely?" He didn't answer. I handed him copies of the documents. "I know what's mine, and I know what you've tried to move out of reach." For the first time since the voicemail, I saw something like shame cross his face. "I never meant to take advantage of you," he said, "but you did, and now we're going to do this the right way." That conversation marked the end of something and the beginning of something else. Not freedom, not yet, but the steady reclaiming of my own voice. The voicemail had been a mistake, but everything that followed was a choice, and I was done choosing silence. The paperwork took weeks. Weeks of signatures and meetings and measured conversations that felt nothing like the life Daniel and I had once shared. Each document was a quiet acknowledgement that love, when neglected long enough, turns into logistics. I approached it all with a calm that surprised even me, not because I wasn't hurting, but because I had crossed a line inside myself. I was no longer asking to be chosen. I was choosing. Daniel tried, in his way, to soften what was happening. He brought coffee once when he came to collect the last of his things. He asked if I was eating enough, sleeping enough. The concern felt familiar, almost comforting, until I realized it belonged to a version of him that no longer existed. "I don't need caretaking," I told him gently. "I need clarity." He nodded, the words landing where they should have months ago. It was around that time that the truth found its way beyond the walls of our home, not through gossip or anger, but through inevitability. Our friends noticed Daniel wasn't coming around anymore. Questions surfaced carefully at first, wrapped in concern. When I told them, I didn't embellish, I didn't dramatize. I simply said, "He was unfaithful, and I found out by accident." The reaction was swift but dignified. People don't always need details to understand where accountability lies. Some reached out to Daniel, some didn't. I let them navigate that for themselves. What surprised me most was how little I wanted revenge. I didn't need to humiliate him or confront her. What I wanted was restoration, not of the marriage, but of myself. Still, consequences have a way of unfolding even when you don't push them. Daniel's workplace found out when he asked for time off he couldn't explain. The woman he'd been seeing worked in the same professional circle, though not directly with him. Word traveled, boundaries were examined, questions were asked. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet tightening of lines that had been crossed too easily. One evening, Daniel called me, his voice strained. "She's upset," he said. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of that sentence. "I'm not the person to comfort you about that," I replied. "I know," he said. "I just didn't realize how complicated this would become." I almost laughed. Almost. Complicated is what happens when you try to build a future on borrowed time. The first real test of my resolve came at a family gathering, a small dinner hosted by Daniel's sister. I hadn't planned to go, but she called and asked me herself. "You're still family to me," she said. "If you want to come, there will be a place for you." I hesitated, then agreed. I didn't want to shrink my world further. Daniel arrived late. He looked thinner, more tired than I remembered. When he saw me, surprise flickered across his face, followed by something like regret. We exchanged polite greetings, nothing more. At one point during the evening, someone asked how he was doing. He paused, then said quietly, "I'm dealing with the consequences of my choices." No one pressed him further. There was a dignity in that restraint that I appreciated. Accountability doesn't require spectacle. After dinner, his sister pulled me aside. "You handled this with grace," she said, "more than most would." I smiled softly. Grace is easier when you stop expecting people to become someone else. The months that followed were slow but steady. I redecorated the house, not dramatically, just enough to make it mine again. I painted the guest room a soft gray and moved my favorite chair into the corner by the window. I started taking long walks in the mornings, noticing the way the light shifted across the street as the seasons changed. I learned the sound of my own solitude. It was not empty, it was spacious. Daniel and I finalized the divorce in early spring. The day we signed the last papers, he looked at me across the table and said, "I'm sorry I didn't cherish what we had." I met his gaze calmly. "I hope you learn how to cherish honesty," I replied. That was the last time we spoke at length. A few weeks later, I received another voicemail from him. This time, it was meant for me. He said, "I hope you're well. I just wanted you to know I understand now what I lost. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know." I listened once, then I deleted it. Some messages arrive too late to change anything. That doesn't make them meaningless, it just makes them complete. As summer approached, I found myself smiling more often, not because everything was healed, but because I was, slowly, intentionally. I volunteered for extra shifts at the library. I took a pottery class on Tuesday nights and learned how to shape wet clay into something that could hold water without leaking. I made friends who knew me only as I was now, not as someone's wife, not as a quiet half of a couple, but as a whole person. One afternoon, while cleaning out an old drawer, I found my phone from that night, the one that had held the voicemail that changed everything. I charged it, curious, and scrolled through old messages. There it was, the accidental truth, the fracture that led to my freedom. I didn't listen to it again. I didn't need to, because some endings are not meant to be revisited. They are meant to be learned from, and in that learning, I found something unexpected. Not bitterness, not anger, but a quiet gratitude for the moment I stopped pretending I hadn't heard what my life was trying to tell me. Healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in fragments. Small, ordinary moments that don't announce themselves as milestones until much later, when you look back and realize you're standing somewhere new. For me, one of those moments came on a quiet Saturday morning. I was standing in the kitchen, barefoot, sunlight spilling across the counter, when I realized I was humming. Not loudly, not happily, just absent-mindedly, the way people do when their thoughts are no longer weighed down. I stopped and listened to myself, surprised. For years, Daniel had been the one who hummed. I used to tease him about it, tell him he sounded like a broken radio stuck between stations. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped noticing when he stopped, and now, without trying, the sound had found its way to me. Life settled into a new rhythm. I woke when I wanted, ate when I was hungry, spoke when I had something to say, and stayed silent without guilt when I didn't. The house felt lighter, not because it was empty, but because it was honest. Every object in it belonged to a version of my life that wasn't pretending anymore. Friends came by more often, not to check on me, not with worried eyes or careful questions, but to sit, to talk, to share pieces of themselves the way people do when they trust your strength. I learned something important during those conversations. People don't always know how to support grief, but they recognize clarity when they see it. One evening, my sister asked me something that lingered long after she left. "Do you ever wonder," she said, "if the voicemail hadn't come to you, how long it would have gone on?" I thought about that for a while before answering. "I don't wonder anymore," I said, "because it did come, and that's the story I have." There was power in accepting that, not as fate, not as punishment, but as information. The truth doesn't always arrive gently, but when it does arrive, it offers a choice, to stay small or to grow honest. I chose honesty. That choice showed itself in unexpected ways. I started saying no without explaining myself. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I corrected people when they assumed things about my life that no longer fit. Once, a neighbor asked, "Does your husband still travel so much for work?" I smiled politely. "I don't have a husband anymore," I said. The words felt neutral, factual, not heavy, not sharp. She stumbled over an apology, but I waved it away. "It's all right," I told her. "I'm not broken." And I wasn't. Months later, I ran into Daniel unexpectedly at the grocery store. We stood in the produce aisle, oranges stacked between us like a quiet barrier. He looked healthier somehow, older too, but steadier. "How are you?" he asked. "Good," I said, and meant it. He nodded, searching my face for something I no longer owed him. "I'm trying to be better," he said. "I hope you are, for yourself." That was the extent of it. No tension, no unfinished business tugging at my sleeve, just two people acknowledging a shared past without trying to step back into it. As I walked away, pushing my cart toward the checkout, I felt something settle fully into place. Closure isn't a conversation, it's a feeling, and it doesn't require agreement from both sides. The voicemail had once felt like an ending, but endings, I've learned, are rarely the full story. They are doorways disguised as walls. I began to write again, not professionally, not for anyone else, just small reflections in a notebook I kept by the bed. Thoughts about trust, about self-respect, about the quiet damage we do to ourselves when we accept less than truth in the name of love. One night, I wrote this: "If someone has to hide you to keep another life intact, you are not being loved, you are being managed." I closed the notebook and turned off the light, feeling a deep, unfamiliar peace. I never met the woman Daniel had been involved with. I didn't need to. She wasn't the villain of my story, and I wasn't the victim of hers. We were simply two people orbiting the same dishonesty at different distances. I hoped she found clarity too, but her path was not mine to walk. The last time I thought about the voicemail, the accidental one that wasn't meant for me,
I realized something that surprised me. It had given me back my hearing, not just for words, but for instincts, for the quiet inner voice that had been whispering for years, asking me to pay attention, asking me to trust myself. I had finally listened, and in listening, I found something better than answers. I found myself.
There's a moment, sometime after loss, when you stop introducing yourself through what you survived. It doesn't happen loudly. No one marks it on a calendar. For me, it happened on an ordinary afternoon at the library when a woman I'd helped find a book smiled and said, "You have a very calming presence." I thanked her, watching as she walked away, and felt something warm settle in my chest. Calm. That was the word people used now. Not strong despite what happened, not brave after everything, just calm. I carried that word with me on the walk home, letting it roll around in my mind like a smooth stone. Calm wasn't something I'd been before, not really. I'd been accommodating, patient, flexible. Calm is different. Calm comes from knowing where you stand. The house greeted me the way it always did now, quiet, but not lonely. I opened the windows, letting fresh air move through the rooms, lifting the curtains slightly. I put on music, low and instrumental, something that didn't demand attention but offered companionship. And then I did something I hadn't done since the voicemail night. I sat down and allowed myself to grieve. Not the betrayal, not the marriage, but the woman I had been when I believed love required endurance more than truth. I thought about her gently, about how hard she tried, about how much she gave without keeping score. There was no anger in the remembering, only compassion. She had done the best she could with what she knew then. And now I knew more. People often assume healing means forgetting. It doesn't. Healing means remembering without bleeding. Daniel faded into the background of my life in the way people do when their chapter has ended naturally. Occasionally, mutual friends mentioned him, where he'd moved, how work was going. I listened without reaction. His life no longer needed my attention to continue. One afternoon, my sister came over with old photo albums she'd found while cleaning out our parents' attic. We sat on the floor, pages spread around us, laughing at hairstyles we thought were sophisticated at the time. At one point, she paused on a photo of Daniel and me from years ago. We were younger, sunburned, smiling at something outside the frame. "You look happy here," she said carefully. "I was," I replied. She looked relieved by that answer. "And I don't regret it," I added. "That matters. Because regret can be another kind of prison. I refuse to rewrite my past as foolish just to justify my present. Love, even when it ends badly, can still have been real." As the year turned, I noticed something else changing. My instincts were sharper now. I trusted the pauses, the hesitations, the places where words didn't quite line up with actions. I no longer rushed to fill silences. Silence, I'd learned, tells the truth faster than speech. I began mentoring a younger coworker at the library, a woman newly married, full of questions about balancing herself with partnership. I never told her my whole story. I didn't need to. Instead, I offered something simpler. "Pay attention to how you feel when you speak," I told her once. "If you start editing yourself too much, ask why." She nodded, thoughtful. That was enough. One evening, while clearing out emails, I found a saved audio file attached to an old message, backed up automatically from my phone. The voicemail. My finger hovered over it. I could listen, I knew that. I could reopen the sound, the moment, the fracture. But I didn't. Instead, I deleted the file permanently. Not out of anger, not out of denial, but because I no longer needed proof of what I already understood. The voicemail had done its job. It had interrupted my life long enough for me to hear myself clearly, and that clarity stayed. I spent my birthday that year alone by choice. I cooked my favorite meal, opened a bottle of wine, and sat on the porch as evening settled in.
The sky shifted from blue to indigo, the air cooling just enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. I thought about how different this birthday felt from the last. No waiting, no hoping someone would remember, no quiet disappointment tucked behind politeness. Just presence. I raised my glass, not to endings, but to awareness. Because sometimes the most painful message you receive is also the one that saves you from living half awake. And sometimes the voicemail that wasn't meant for you is exactly the one you were meant to hear. The story itself had reached its emotional rest.
As I sit here now, thinking back on everything that changed my life, I realize this wasn't really a story about a voicemail. It was a story about listening. Listening to the pauses in a marriage, listening to the ache you keep explaining away, listening to the quiet voice inside you that keeps whispering, something isn't right. That voicemail didn't break my life. It interrupted a lie I had been surviving inside. And sometimes that interruption is mercy. If you're listening to this and you feel that same tightness in your chest, if something in your life doesn't quite sit right, but you've been calling it love or loyalty or patience, I hope my story reminds you of this. You don't need proof to deserve honesty. You don't need permission to trust yourself. And you don't need to stay silent just to keep the peace. Some endings hurt, but some endings give you your voice back. And once you hear yourself clearly, you never live the same way again. So now I want to ask you, did you like this story? What would you have done if you heard that voicemail? I'd really love to read your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for listening, for supporting these stories, and for being part of this space where truth is spoken gently, but honestly. If these stories speak to you, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these voices reach the people who need them most. Until next time, take care of your heart and listen closely to what it's trying to tell you.